communion on the hand destroys faith in the real presence of Jesus in the sacrament. So,
hello everyone, I'm Joseph Dinesh, a Catholic commentator from Sydney, Australia. Normally, I avoid commenting on other Catholic commentators as I try to follow the principle that Jesus gave us. If they are not against us, they are for us. However, recent claims by Taylor Marshall has crossed a line by spreading unnecessary guilt among the Catholic faithful. I always feel strongly about resisting anyone who imposes false guilt, whether it's charismatics saying you must speak in tongues to be saved, or rat-rats claiming it's irreverent to receive communion in hand. In the upcoming clip, Taylor Marshall makes several claims regarding receiving communion in the hand, and he makes many wild correlations and causations, but today we will focus on these three things. First, he says that the early Christians did not practice receiving communion in the hand, or if they did, it was only in extreme conditions. Second, he says that receiving communion in hand is irreverent. Third, he says that the practice of receiving communion in hand weakens the belief in the real presence among Catholics. Now, first, let's listen to this clip and then we will debunk it one by one.
Greatest impediment to people believing in the Eucharist was receiving in the hand while standing. By the way, your hands aren't consecrated by holy orders. A priest has consecrated hands, right? But I'm talking about all things being equal. Can we not try to be more reverent with Jesus? And wouldn't being more reverent with Jesus bring about a greater sense of devotion, faith, adoration? It did happen in the early church. As soon as Christianity becomes legal, we find the church fathers and the councils and the synods moving towards the practice. So by the time you get to the 600s, the lay people are receiving communion on the tongue.
First, communion and the early Christians. Taylor Marshall is completely mistaken when he claims that early Christians did not practice receiving communion in the hand or that it was done only in extreme circumstances. In reality, receiving communion in the hand was the norm in the early church as evidenced by the writings of the early church fathers and historical records. Saint Cyril of Jerusalem from the 4th century provides one of the clearest explanations of this practice. In his catechetical lectures, he instructs, when you approach, do not come with your hands stretched flat or your fingers apart, but rather place your left hand as a throne for your right, which is to receive the king. Then take care that nothing is lost. This level of detail shows that receiving communion in the hand was not only practiced, but also accompanied by specific instructions on how to do so reverently. More so, receiving communion in the tongue was formalized only closer to the 13th century after the doctrine of transubstantiation was formally articulated by the Fourth Lateran Council. Now, my argument isn't that we should do it just because the early Christian did it. The point is, receiving communion in hand is not some modern invention from the Second Vatican Council or the result of irreverent priest. It is a legitimate practice rooted in the tradition of the church. Second, receiving communion in hand and the irreverence shown. Some radical traditionalist Catholics argue that receiving communion in the hand is irreverent, claiming that our hands are unclean, that particles of the host fall down to the ground, or that only consecrated hands, those of the priest, should handle the body of Christ. However, the church teaches that the entire person, body and soul, should approach the Eucharist with reverence. The Catechism of the Catholic Church emphasizes the disposition of the heart and the spiritual readiness over the method of reception. It's not the cleanliness of our hands, but the purity of our hearts that matters most. When received with reverence, our hands are no less worthy than our tongues. Additionally, the concern about particles falling down is not unique to communion in hand. Particles can also fall down from the host or the priest's fingers when communion is received on the tongue. In fact, receiving on the tongue might pose its own risks, such as accidental contact with saliva, which could increase the risk of mishandling the Eucharist. The idea that only priests should handle the Eucharist doesn't hold up either. Extraordinary ministers of the Holy Communion, who are lay people, are permitted by the church regulations to distribute the Eucharist. This reinforces that reverence, not only consecrated hands alone, is the key to handling the Eucharist. Third, communion in hand and weakening of belief in the real presence. Some argue that receiving communion in the hand has caused a weakening of belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. However, this claim lacks both theological and logical support. Saying that the method of reception directly impacts belief in the real presence is like saying eating with a fork rather than chopsticks makes the food less nutritious and tasty. There is no evidence to suggest receiving in the hand leads to weaker belief. In fact, belief in the real presence is a matter of faith and proper catechesis, not the physical way one receives communion. Whether on tongue or in hand, belief is shaped by an understanding of church teaching and one's spiritual formation. A strong catechetical foundation ensures that the faithful receive the Eucharist with reverence regardless of how it is physically received. And more so, I would challenge Taylor Marshall to show that receiving Eucharist in hand has a direct causation in weakening belief in the real presence of the Eucharist. In conclusion, the arguments against receiving communion in hand fall apart under scrutiny. It is a practice rooted in the tradition of the early church, fully supported by church teaching, and done with the same reverence as receiving on tongue. What truly matters is the faith and reverence with which we approach the Eucharist, not the method by which we receive it. Finally, I would like to leave you with this quote. In the Catholic Church itself, all possible care must be taken that we hold that faith which has been believed everywhere, always, by all. I hope this video is helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. God bless you.